Hey guys, welcome to the channel. My name is Shivank and I'm currently a year 13 student and I'll be starting medicine this year at university. I thought what better way to spend my time during the holidays than to start a YouTube channel. Anyways, let's get on with the video. As mentioned in the title, I took the UCAT last year and in this video I'll explain how I prepared for it and how I scored the top decile. Now, with the UCAT I had other priorities to also consider, for instance my EPQ or my personal statement. And so it was very important that I prioritized each one and was able to focus well on all of them. Hence, for the UCAT, rather than doing it within 1 month, I decided to take 1.5 months prior to my exam. I think this was really useful because for the first couple of weeks, I could just familiarize myself to the test. For instance, the idea to get to know the different sections, verbal reasoning, etc., and spend around half an hour each day. Then later on, I slowly progressed that to 1 hour, and towards the end, near the test result, I spent around 1.5 hours to 2 hours preparing for the test. I think it was really useful because I slowly progressed forwards and was much more confident towards the end. UCAT tests your ability to answer a range of questions under pressurized conditions. That's essentially the main purpose of the UCAT. The idea that as a doctor you're able to have a range of skills that you can carry out under pressurized conditions. Now, whilst it may initially sound daunting, but by practicing questions repeatedly again and again, we're much more confident and much more familiar with the types of questions they may ask in the exam. And with the sources that I mentioned, the exam is very similar to the sources and therefore be much easier for you to answer the questions. 5 sections of the UCAT: verbal reasoning, decision making, quantitative reasoning, abstract reasoning, and situational judgment. The first 4 sections are scored from a range of 300 to 900, and the fifth section, situational judgment, is scored on the basis of bands, for instance, band 1, band 2, etc. So before delving into each section and the useful tips for them, I want to give some useful tips that overall, general tips that can help with all the sections and hopefully improve your score. So, first tip is the idea of practice. I know you've heard this plenty of times, practice makes perfect, but with the UCAT it really is the case. The idea that if you keep practicing, you're bound to improve. However, it's not just about practicing any types of questions, it's about practicing your weaknesses. Because if you keep practicing questions which you're confident on, it gives you that full sense of confidence, the idea that you've done something good. For instance, when I was practicing, I always used to do abstract questions that were very basic, and I used to have that full sense of confidence that, oh, I've done lots of questions today and I've done all them all right, I've done a lot of work. When in reality, I had neglected the hard questions and therefore had not done much progress. And so, first tip, make sure that you practice, but make sure you practice your weaknesses and improve on them. Moreover, the idea of weaknesses, the idea that you may be able to identify a question that you're getting wrong repeatedly again and again, but not able to identify why you're getting the question wrong. Could it be a key word that you're not understanding, or maybe the way the question is phrased? Whatever it is, you need to spend some time doing it. This is the tip that I was told. So if there's a question that you're getting wrong, first take some time to understand as to what the question is really asking. Is it something that you're not understanding in the question or something that's lacking in terms of information? Once you've understood that, spend some time trying to figure out what your mistake is. If not, try doing similar questions to that question, and then you can figure out what mistakes you've been making in each of those ones. Because once you have more examples, it'll be much easier to identify what the mistake is. For instance, in verbal reasoning, I identified that when I was reading the question, rather than understanding what the question said, I just used to pick out one key word, such as a name, a date, place, and just try and figure that out in the extract. And this clearly didn't work because if I didn't understand the question, how was I supposed to figure out in the passage? However, having reflected upon this, I ensured that I could do it later on in the test. Something which is also helpful, which I probably should have done, is the idea of noting these down. In my mind, I just put it in the back of my mind, but instead something that would have been much more productive and useful would have been to write down any mistakes that I made so that on the day of the exam or one day before, I could have like a sheet of all the previous mistakes that I've done, all the previous weaknesses, and how I'd be able to rectify them and make them a strength. I think that's quite useful, so on the exam you ensure that you don't make the same mistakes that you were making beforehand. This is something that I really wish I knew well before the day of my exam. This is something that would have really helped me, I think, and enabled me to even get a higher mark. So, the idea of getting used to the tech. What I mean by tech is the idea of, for example, the keyboard shortcuts. The idea that Control N means next question, Control P means previous, etc., and so forth. And also the idea of inbuilt calculator and how you can access this. I think this is really useful because for me, I only realized about this 1 or 2 weeks before the exam. And I tried using the keyboard shortcuts and, for example, the inbuilt calculator and the keyboard shortcuts for that, for instance, the calculator on the right side, but I wasn't accustomed to it. And so I couldn't really implement this when I was revising, and so in the end I decided not to use this. I think in hindsight, if I had started this 1 month or 1.5 months before when I started, it would have been much better, and I would have been able to save at least some more time to answer maybe 1 or 2 extra questions. This is not a major thing, but I think it's really useful to have any form of extra time if you can get it. And so I think it's very important that you look these up, the inbuilt calculator, I'll say again, and the keyboard shortcuts. The idea of flagging harder questions. Now, I know this is so easy to say, if you find a question hard, just flag it and move on. However, in a test, maybe it's just the lack of confidence or the stress, you always have doubts about questions, or at least I do. For instance, a question which I would be normally much more confident in if it wasn't if it wasn't in the test conditions, I would feel very doubtful and not be able to know what the right answer is. However, what I think is very useful and what I implemented in my exam is I just used to pick an option which I was somewhat confident in, not fully, and just flag it. Just flag it instantly. Even if you have some doubt, just flag it, and then at the end you can come back and review it. Because that way you're twice as confident that you got the right answer rather than having a hint of doubt that maybe you were wrong. I think that's clearly much better, and you know if you flag it that you can quickly review it at the end of the test. I think this is something that's a big mistake many people do, is that they don't flag the questions, and at the end they have to try and figure out which ones they were stuck on. So just flagging the questions makes it very quick and makes the test much more smoother. Furthermore, the idea of tracking your progress. I think it's really important that you track your progress and how you're improving over time. Whether there's some things you're improving upon in your strengths, and whether there's some things that are weaker so you can improve upon these as well. And the online source that I used was Medify, and I think Medify was really great at this. The idea that every single day I could see how many questions I've attempted, which sections I've improved on every single day, was really rewarding to me, because I could see any form of improvement over time, and I could use this to work harder to see even further improvements. Furthermore, with the mock results, you could also see a visual chart of your improvements and your grades overall, and so I think this was really useful. And if you don't use Medify and use other sources, you can also have a manual form of doing this. This is quite also useful because some people prefer writing it, but for me it was already done on Medify, and I think just small things like this, it really helps you boost your confidence because you can see your improvements over time, and it's also useful just to be able to identify any weaknesses so that you can rectify them before the test date. Let's move on to the next sections. Verbal reasoning. This is the section which I personally found the most difficult with, maybe because I just don't really like English that much. But anyways, with verbal reasoning, I can still give loads of useful tips having done the exam. So there's 11 passages with 4 questions each, so in total 44 questions, and you only have 21 minutes to answer them. So you have to be really quick and be able to read the sections of the extract and then pick one of the options. Now, most of the options are true, false, or can't tell. These are most of the question types within verbal reasoning. True meaning it's obviously in the extract, false meaning it is the opposite, so it's incorrect in the extract, and can't tell it's not within the extract. Most students are hesitant to put can't tell because they're like, why would the question ask about it if it's not going to be in the extract? But that's the whole point. They're trying to trick you out and waste your time, so you either end up putting false rather than can't tell. But just trust your gut instinct as to what to put. So, my useful tips. Firstly, don't read the whole passage. This is already contradictory, but try not to read the whole passage. This is because you'll waste a lot of time reading the passage, then the question, and then rereading the passage. In my opinion, I think it's much better to read the question, understand it fully, and then pick out the keywords from it. For example, the name, date, place, etc. By picking out these specific details, you can then look back at the passage and then figure out where you see these details. If, for instance, you're not able to find it, fine, then skim read the entire passage if you really want, or you can just reread sections that you didn't understand. Furthermore, the UCAT is a mixture of factual and comprehension types. So with factual, you also have to use the same process, look at the fact in the question, what's mentioned, and try finding a similar fact or using the similar words in the passage. However, with comprehension type, there's often a useful tip. So the first sentence of most comprehension passages usually describe what the paragraph will be about. And this is really useful because if you can understand the first line, then you can understand, should I read the rest of the passage? Because if it has no mention of what the question's asking, then you can just skip on to the next passage. For instance, if the question was asking about chocolates and the first paragraph had no mention of chocolates, then there's no point. But if you read the second paragraph and then the first line mentions about chocolates or anything related to it, you know that there's a chance it could be in the second paragraph. Something as simple as that can be really useful and save a lot of time. Furthermore, the next one, which I've not really seen on any UCAT videos, is if the question type says always, never, or all. So I'll say it again, always, never, or all, then it's highly likely that it's wrong. Now, this is not always the case, as I just said again, but just be mindful if you're running out of time and you see a question that says, oh, this always happens in the extract, or this always happens, it's highly likely that it's wrong. And it's just a guess, but it's a higher probability that you'll get it right. Decision making. This is a new section that has been added to the UCAT. Okay, well, I say new, it's been there for quite some time, but anyways, it's about charts, tables, text, graphs, etc. So with decision making, as said by the name, you get presented with a small extract, small chart, etc., and you have to be able to make a decision as to whether the statement is yes, as in it's right, or no, it's incorrect. So for instance, in this extract, Camilla has a large diamond crown. We simply have to say yes or no, depending on whether it is in the extract. Also, these are the notes I've made, and hence I'm just talking from based upon my notes. I think it's also useful if you make your own notes, because you will best understand them yourself if you write them down and make yourself. So with tips with decision making, I think it's very important to trust your gut instinct. Fine, I said it right. Because with decision making, there's often lots of trick questions. So the first time you read it, you'll bear in mind all of these trick questions and you'll fully understand it. However, the more you read it, the more you'll continue to doubt yourself, because you'll be like, oh, did I leave this part out? Did I leave this? And whilst you may still end up with the right answer, you'll be wasting a lot of time. So make sure when you read the question, read it fully and properly, and make sure you don't get tricked by any of the words there, and just trust your gut instinct. Also, with statistic questions or any maths questions within decision making, just use the whiteboard. I think whiteboard is really useful because if you have loads of numbers to consider, it's very useful to just write on the whiteboard and then refer back to it afterwards. Moving on to quantitative reasoning. This is a section which I quite enjoyed because it involved a lot of math skills, but it is really time pressured. I think this is perhaps the second most time pressured out of the four, with abstract reasoning obviously being the most time pressured, which I'll get on to later. So with quantitative reasoning, there can be a wide variety of questions, testing tables, charts, graphs, etc. So what useful tips can I give for quantitative reasoning? I think with quantitative reasoning, it's really important that you learn to do your estimates really quickly. I think it's really important because you'll be very quick in the test if you can just estimate, like, okay, this is approximately 1 foot, this is 1 meter, etc. And then that really help you just give you say they give you the extra time you need at the end. Also, start a flag if you're falling behind. If you know it's a convoluted question and you're going to spend way too much time doing it, just flag it and come back at the end. I've personally found taxes questions really difficult in quantitative reasoning because of how much time and how much I needed to spend. So I'll quickly read the question. Sometimes it talks about taxes, but it's a really basic question, but most of the times it's really long, convoluted. So I just used to flag it and then come back if I had time. Also, whenever you're flagging, make sure you just put a question, an answer down, because many people may not expect this. Just flag it and then they forget to put an answer down, and then they just lose a free mark because there's no negative marking in the UCAT. So I don't see why not. Just put any answer down, and then when you come back to it, you can just change it depending upon your calculations. Also, know your basic maths, so conversions, percentages, speed, distance, ratios. By conversions, I mean, for example, how many kilometers in a mile, how many feet in 1 yard. I think it's 3. Know your percentages, obviously, speed equals distance over time. This is an equation which is used quite a lot within the test, so make sure you use it and can rearrange it. Distance, ratios. Make sure you can also use a whiteboard. I think whiteboard is really helpful because it has lots of facts. You can just note them down quickly and then refer back to them. Also, the calculator within quantitative reasoning can store, well, I think one or two values. So make sure you can also use that to store a value and then reuse it again. When rounding, make sure you round correctly. I think this is very important. For example, if the question was 990 and you had to divide by 25, you could obviously just round it up to 1000 and divide by 25 to get 40. This is much more simpler rather than doing 990 divided by 25, which would take quite long. And then depending upon the answer options, you can just choose one quite easily. And again, read the question first before reading the passage and graphs. Now moving on to abstract reasoning. This is the section which I personally enjoyed most and did perhaps the most practice. I guess that's probably why I did the best in this section. So firstly, the most common types of questions they can ask. There's a type 1 where there's a set A and a set B, and you get 5 different questions, 5 different options, and you have to know which one goes into set A, which one goes into set B, etc. Then there's a type 2, so you're presented with a series and you have to put which one goes next in the series. Then there's a type 3 which completes the statement. So there can often be something missing out and you just have to put one statement in and you have to guess which one it is. So these are the most common types, where type 1, set A, set B being the most common. So what tips can I give? This is, as I mentioned, the most time pressured one out of the 4. So I would recommend you do the questions as quick as you can. And if you can't find a pattern, just flag it, and then when you come back, there's chances that if you review it again, you'll be able to find it. But mainly flag the question if you're spending too much time on it. Also, there's various acronyms I know out there like SCANS, for instance, but the one that I used was SSSPN. So shape, shading, size, place or position, and then number. So shape, what kind of shape is it? Is it circle? Is it a square? What kind of size is it? Is it rigid? Is it smooth? Symmetry, etc. Shading, white, grey, or black. And the rest are also mentioned here: size, place, and number. I think this is really useful because if you go through this chronologically, you can then eliminate all the options and be able to identify what the pattern is without that. But sometimes you don't need to go through all of this because it can take some time, but often it's really quite obvious. For instance, if there's one shape that has, if set A only have 2 shapes in each boxes and set 3 have 3 shapes in each boxes, there's no point of using the SSPN because we can clearly see that they have 2 shapes and they have 3. But there is a caveat to that, the idea that sometimes there may be more than one pattern. The idea that whilst set A has there's 2 shapes, each one is white. And whereas set B, there are 3 shapes, but each one is black. So you need to make sure that the shapes you have match both the criteria. Now, a tip that I used is, if you're running out of time, don't focus on try and find 2 rules. Often go for 1 rule, and then most likely you should get at least 4 out of 5. Oh, okay, they should get at least 4 out of 5, if not 3 out of 5 from the options. Now, I know obviously you want to try to get 5 out of 5, but in the time pressure conditions, getting 4 is good enough, because you'll spend too much time trying to find 2 patterns, whereas you could do much better just finding 1 pattern, the idea of finding 3 shapes, rather than having to spend time and find that, oh, it has to also be white in color. Also with lines, so this is slightly different. If you want to know, there's lines, so you can know the intersections, how many intersections there are in set A, like each one has 2. For example, are they sloping at an angle, and they have the angles. So for lines, intersections, sloping, and angles, right angles, etc. So those are the main tips for abstract reasoning, I think. Make sure you keep track of your time and just flag a question if you have any doubt. Situational judgment is the 5th section in the UCAT. This is essentially a section on its own because it has a different level of marking. For instance, instead of the scores, so 300 to 900, there's now bands, so band 1, band 2, etc. So with situational judgment, I found this was most closely reflected in medicine. The idea, for instance, you may have to talk to various peers, various patients, and how would you do it? Is it appropriate, not appropriate, etc. So the questions that they typically ask are, for instance, tell the nurse how he's feeling and ask her opinion, or it's okay to breach confidentiality in the situation. So for instance, there's 4 options. So 1, a very appropriate thing to do; 2nd, appropriate but not ideal; 3rd, inappropriate but not awful; and 4th, a very inappropriate thing to do. So the idea of breaching confidentiality is always inappropriate unless there's someone's life at risk or some kind of situation. But in most circumstances, it's obviously a very inappropriate thing to do to breach confidentiality. Now with situational judgment, the questions are very similar but just simply rephrased with different names, and very slightly sometimes they change it. So with situational judgment, any questions that I've had doubts on or any tips that I thought, I made sure to note them down. I think this really helped in the exam. So for instance, in this I've written, safety of patient is therefore likely to be most important consideration. This is always true because Ultimately, the role of a doctor is to make sure that the patient is safe. The idea that there's no point of medicine if you're not really keeping this patient safe, because that's what you really want to achieve within medicine. So we always want to preserve the dignity of the patient and the safety. Dignity meaning we want to respect the patient and make sure that they're treated the way they would like to be treated in the hospital. Furthermore, never do anything that makes the patient question the integrity of the healthcare. The idea that if there's a colleague next to you and you start shouting or confronting them in front of the patient, this will have a very negative impact upon the patient itself. And so this is a very inappropriate thing to do in a healthcare setting. So whenever you have a question about, like, for example, things that you do in front of a patient, is this appropriate? It's always an inappropriate thing to do. With situations, unless it's really unavoidable, try and resolve them as quick as possible. This enables arguments to be resolved very quickly and prevents them from escalating further. If a situation is blatantly illegal, you need to report it to the police or to the supervisor, because this is clearly not under your control, and the idea that you need to really report it to a police supervisor. Furthermore, with these questions, you also usually have your role written in your first sentence. For example, you are in the perspective of David, who is a first-year doctor, etc. Usually, within medicine, you don't really know all the information yourself. It's very important that whenever you're doubtful about anything, that you ask a fellow colleague or peer, and they can provide guidance to you. So when asking peers is very appropriate response. So as I mentioned, safety or confidentiality are very important and are usually the strongest cases in this. So overall, I think situational judgment, if you really understand the question, sometimes it can be very logical. The idea that if someone is blatantly threatening someone, you should call a supervisor or call the police immediately. If someone's safety is compromised, that's the ultimate priority, and so it's a very appropriate thing to do to preserve his dignity, etc. I really hope this helped with UCAT, and hopefully your UCAT preparation goes well. My final tips are what sources I used, and I think this will be really useful. So as I mentioned, Medify is honestly the best source to use for this. The amount of countless questions they have and countless papers really helped, and I was able to boost my confidence as well by doing more and more practice questions, and because it also highlighted what my weaknesses are in each section. It also gives you like a percentage, so you can try and increase the percentage every single time. Alongside the Medify, there's also the official UCAT papers. In my opinion, Medify was very good, but for some reason I didn't find the verbal reasoning as useful, in my opinion. I think maybe because I didn't do as enough practice, because I personally found it quite long, but in hindsight, I think more resources for verbal reasoning would be better. So maybe for Medify, if you try using more and more verbal reasoning sources, that would be better. But the official UCAT website has past papers as well, and I would recommend try doing one paper once you're halfway through your preparation, another paper once you're 3/4, and the last couple of papers nearer to the exam. I think this is really useful because that way you're not wasting these resources, because once they're done you can't redo it, and you'll also be in a position where you're comfortable to do the exam. Bear in mind that even if the paper does not go well for the UCAT, it's not the end of the world. The idea there's many other universities that you can try for. BMAT universities as well are applicable. At the end of the day, if you try your best, there's nothing to regret for, and I think if you follow that advice and keep practicing, there's no reason not to do good. So thank you for the watching, and if possible, please subscribe.